If you've been with me for a while, then you know that I am not somebody who singularly blames feminism for all problems in the world, much less all problems relating to men and women. I think the problems that we can observe today are very much a confluence of several different factors, and there's no doubt that feminism has played a political and perhaps even more importantly, a cultural role in the development of things. But I think ultimately we have technological development to thank for the state of the world on many different fronts, but in particular to thank for the state of affairs regarding men and women, which is to say, feminism never would have gotten off the ground had there been no industrial revolution, had protocols of safety not been introduced, had, simply speaking, modern civilization as we know it, with all its attendant benefits, had that not come into existence, then we probably would have never had anything called feminism. So feminism, ultimately, in my view, is a byproduct of a number of technological developments that led to increased comfort, safety, health, etc., that then paved the way for women to feel comfortable enough to push for their ideological wants and desires. And in light of that, I want to talk about what the real problem with feminism is, functionally speaking. Because, in general, I think most problems in the world are derivational problems, and I'll explain in a little bit what I mean by that. But another way of saying this would be the reason why a problem exists, why a problem is just as important that there is a problem, that a problem exists. And this is something that people frequently overlook in general with regards to the solution to their problems. It's a basic medical fact that the etiology of a disease is very important in determining how you're going to treat it. And so too is it the case with pretty much any problem in the world. And feminism, above all, feminism is not excluded from this. So let me present you with a problem that is seemingly absurd on its face, but nonetheless a problem. Imagine we lived in a world where, for some reason, we'll discuss the reasons in a bit, cranberry juice stains would emerge on your walls and carpet rather frequently. And you really, really got annoyed by that. Because the only thing you could do would make use of the most powerful stain remover to get rid of it. And you simply didn't know why it happened. And I'll offer two possible etiologies for the cranberry juice disease. This is obviously fictitious. On the one hand, it could be that there are people running around, maybe criminals, maybe weirdos, whatever, who are staining people's carpets and walls with cranberry juice. And if you were to apprehend them, then the constant staining of people's walls and carpets with cranberry juice would cease, and that would be a solution. Another possibility, though, in this other dimension, is that for some reason, due to certain interactions in the atmosphere, cranberry juice stains simply emerge from the air, and you have to deal with it one way or another. And there might not be very much you can do. A lot of illnesses are like this, too. As long as you can understand the etiology of the illness, there may or may not be a quote-unquote cure. There might be a piecemeal cure. There might be some way to deal with it. But in any event, you have to figure out what's causing the illness, just as you have to figure out what is causing the mass staining of cranberry juice throughout the kingdom. Now, if it's the case that the atmosphere is simply causing the cranberry juice stains, that's a very different situation, if you think about it, from the case of people running around staining people's carpets and walls surreptitiously or secretly. If you stop those people, then the cranberry juice stains will disappear in time. And this is why I call feminism, as I do most problems, but above all, feminism, a derivational problem. Now, how did this come about? I was actually involved in a debate/discussion with people who actually in many cases were hardcore feminists, who believed all the ideological doctrines and talking points that are put forth. And it occurred to me then, as it has routinely throughout my time on YouTube, that very few to no feminists have spent any time studying the biological groundwork of human beings, or other animals for that matter. but above all, human beings. And when you challenge them and ask them for a story of how this all came to pass, they'll talk about the patriarchy, they'll talk about the wage gap, they'll talk about unpleasant deeds committed against women, and they will offer you their own version of an etiology of this so-called disease, of their own derivation of the problem. What do they say? They'll actually, and this particular feminist use this term, talk about toxic masculinity and how toxic masculinity leads to the state of affairs that we currently find ourselves in. And this is an interesting game to play with feminists, and I'll tell you why. Because there's a very important question to ask here. It's the same question we asked ourselves in the mysterious case of the cranberry juice stains, right? Are they caused by spontaneous atmospheric occurrences? Or are people involved? Well, you ask the same question to feminists, very ideologically driven feminists, and just ask them, where does toxic masculinity come from? Where does the patriarchy come from? Where does society come from? And they generally have no answer to this whatsoever. Time and again, I'll ask this question, and you can tell that there's a short circuit going on in their brains because they haven't thought about the hierarchy, i.e. the organization of life, particularly advanced life, and how it all came to pass. And generally, what I do is I run them through a thought experiment, which isn't even a thought experiment because this is almost certainly what happened, but nonetheless, that you ask the question, do you think dinosaurs had a culture and society? Now, some of them, of course, will say yes, and of course they'll also ask what it has to do with the topic in question, which is normal. But in general, most people, including many feminists, don't think that dinosaurs had an advanced culture, society, or civilization. And then you will point out that for most of organisms' existence on Earth, only the tiniest fraction of that time had any semblance of what we would call a society, a civilization, a quote-unquote patriarchy, or toxic masculinity. Which is to say, for the most part, to invoke the great and wise words of the scion of Dagda, the Baron of Brooklyn and the Lord of Ireland, for the most part, organisms were simply operating off of Ooga Booga with nothing else in the picture, just Ooga Booga, just the red tooth and claw of nature and their drives to survive and to reproduce. And that was pretty much it. And the point that I always try to drive home, whether I'm in conversation with reasonable individuals or actually feminists, is the following. Society, so-called toxic masculinity, and the whole shebang had to have come from somewhere. It couldn't have simply been something that spontaneously emerged out of the ether or out of nothingness. And so that anyone who thinks about these social problems, particularly feminism, is ignoring at their own peril the massive primordial biological backdrop that occupied billions of years on the planet before any reasonable semblance, any inkling of what we call culture, civilization, society could have existed. Which means that all of these processes, hitherto, have informed the current state of affairs and given us and have absolutely handed down the hardware that we're equipped with, as well as the software we're equipped with, because the software we develop has to exist concomitantly with the hardware we've been given by nature, which is to say, it cannot run counter to the hardware. It has to work, function, run synergistically, which is why the question of why is so important. And you have to pose this question to these people because really, if you don't do that, all you end up doing is running around in circles. There exists a problem called toxic masculinity. The patriarchy exists. There are unpleasant things happening to women, allegedly. All these things, when you mention them without understanding the ideology of where they come from, become boogeymen. Because where something comes from, as I said at the beginning, is just as important as that it exists or that it is. Refer, please, to the cranberry juice story, ridiculous as that might sound. And maybe you will get a concession on the part of some feminists somewhere. They might say something along the lines of, that's all well and good, but I don't care where these problems come from. I care that they exist today, in this normative state we find ourselves in. But that is why these individuals, and all of us, have to care. Why? Because, again, if it's just a bunch of people running around staining people's carpets and walls with cranberry juice. If you stop the people, you can do something about it. If it's something inherent to the atmosphere in this other dimension, there's much less you can do about it. So if you're talking about the primordial, the ooga booga, if you will, of our nature, then that means that these behaviors and divisions, things like the gender pay gap, or women and men choosing different professions on average, or women and men in general having different interests, the whole shebang, if you ignore where that comes from, then you are essentially chasing the boogeyman, because we are not going to rewrite hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history and programming just by declaring this to be a problem. And that's ignoring the lies and the false data that are offered. For example, that there is a gender pay gap. To the extent that there is, it's totally unfounded given the context of how reality actually works. We don't need to talk about it. We've talked about that enough. But the point is that this is why feminism is a derivational problem. And if people wanted to, quote unquote, defeat feminism, whatever that even means, they would have to derive feminism correctly. And to this, I can assure you, the feminists would have no answer, because generally speaking, people on the left, above all feminists, don't believe in the consequences of biology. They will nod their heads, they'll pay some lip service, but they will not acknowledge that it's consequential for how we are and how we got here. If all of these problems that feminists are constantly complaining about were as simple as introducing some new rules and changing some policies, these quote-unquote problems would not persist. To the extent that there are problems, if you wish to call them that, rather than differences, you are not going to erase the ooga booga out of us. You are not going to fundamentally change the nature of men and women and the fact that these are very, very different natures. And if on a larger scale people wanted to oppose feminism or put it in its place, this is how you should proceed. Because feminists do not have a biological leg to stand on, because usually they won't even acknowledge its existence. Anyways, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit like, comment, share, subscribe if you're not yet a subscriber. And if I am still alive, I will check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.